Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Alain de Botton, author of treatises on Proust, philosophy, architecture, travels, status anxiety, and most recently, the pleasures and sorrows of work. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Alain de Botton is the author of nonfiction, fiction, journalism, and various hybrids thereof. He's also a television presenter and a founding member of London's The School of Life. His new book, which follows volumes on Proust, philosophy, travel, and architecture, is The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work. Alain, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
I read in an interview a couple books ago where you said that your method for developing a book was to fill up a notebook with notes you just gathered on subjects in which you were interested, and sooner or later that would be the basis for a book. You just fill in the gaps. Was this the same sort of procedure?
No, I think it was more intentional here. I think what I started off with was work is difficult. I think to be alive in the modern world means probably never being far from a career crisis of one sort or another, and that was really my starting point. Wanted to find out, what are our hopes of work? Where do those hopes go wrong? And where in the working world is satisfaction to be found and dissatisfaction? So those were the sort of guiding questions that led me to the book I've written.
What do you mean when you say a career crisis?
I think a sense. I don't know. For me, it happens often on a Sunday evening, just as the sun is going down. A sense of that gap between what you might hope that work is or could deliver and what it actually is. That gap between expectations and reality. And I think that gap is to feel that gap is a very modern emotion. I think human beings have not always felt it. I think that we live in a world which places very, very high expectations on what work can deliver. And of course, for most of us, it only does so intermittently.
Now, when did humanity come to have such high expectations of their work beyond sustenance?
I think you begin to see attitudes shifting in the middle of the 18th century. You begin to feel the first arguments that suggest that the reason to work is not merely survival, not merely money, the old explanation, but that work, at its best, also has something to do with fulfillment, creativity, authenticity, becoming fully human. So suddenly the idea emerges that really, in order to be a full human being, you need to work. Just as in the past, in, say, ancient Greece, if you listen to someone like Aristotle, he would tell you that working makes you into a slave, that no one can be a decent human being and dependent on a salary. So you get a real reversal of values just about the same time as you get a real reversal or real shift in attitudes towards love, where similarly people start to argue that marriage is not only for practical reasons to raise the kids and pass on the family farm or whatever it might be, but that actually the point of marriage is love. And so you get these two enormous kind of shifts, that the point of work is not just money, but is fulfillment, and the point of love the point of marriage is not just the kids, but it's also love. And we are the heirs of these two big, big shifts, and they are really what we place our hopes in.
How far can we extend this analogy? Do you see as many love crises as career crises going on?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at most people's lives, they're lurching from a career crisis to a love crisis, and sometimes the two go hand in hand. I hope I'm not speaking too autobiographically, but these things are constants of modern life, to doubt your relationships, to question love, and to ask questions about work. Freud famously said in the 1930s that the two great themes and ingredients of life are love and work, and in that, in saying that, he is a quintessential modern. He is one of us.
Now, with the idea of this career crisis, the feeling painfully the gap between expectations of one's career and the reality, going into this, did you find that this was or suspect that this was a universal or something that some people felt and some people did not?
Well, I think it's universal insofar as we can speak of a modern world, which is not just the United States or Europe, but is really the world that's interconnected, that's acquiring prosperity and sharing what originally started off as Western values, but are now global values to do with free enterprise and to do with material progress and these sort of things. Of course, there are people who manage to escape these kinds of anxieties, but they're few and far between. A lot of it has to do with expectations. I mean, if you live in a world which tells you that work can be everything, and it's less than everything, then you will be obviously more dissatisfied than somebody who comes at work from a very modest set of expectations. One of the good things, if one can speak of a good thing coming out of the current financial crisis, is that many people are starting to revise their expectations of work downwards and will say things like, well, it's, at the end of the day, at least it's a job, and that's a strange thing, that sometimes being satisfied is sometimes easier if the expectations are that little bit lower.
You mentioned that in your own career, in writing, that there's a certain form of periodic career crisis feeling you have yourself. Now, this must have put you in, I don't know if awkward is the word, but I think of a lot of people who work jobs that are everyday jobs, and what they fantasize about is oftentimes running away, becoming a writer. Have you had this feeling expressed to you and you've had to say, well, no, there's crises to be had when you're a writer as well?
I think people have got two expectations of writers. One, that they're spectacularly unsuccessful and sit around in despair and eventually commit suicide. The other view is that writers lead a totally charmed life and swan around in their slippers and just have a lovely time penning the occasional poem. Of course, I think most people realistically know that the truth is somewhere in the middle of that. And I think the real problem with writers and the rest of the world is that recently, especially if you look at fiction of the last 20 years or so, there's very little writing about the workplace. It's very strange that work, which is this thing that most of us do most of the time, most of our waking lives, does not get much of a look in literature. And it's a very strange thing. It's I think, to do with the professionalization of writing and the professionalization of most jobs, which mean that most writers have not been part of the ordinary workforce. They might have done a few years at Starbucks while waiting for the agent to call from New York, but essentially they won't have known what it feels like to have a 40-year career. And at the same time, most workplaces are very suspicious of letting writers in to see them. So you get this, as I say, this kind of odd disassociation between what people are reading about and what their lives are actually made up of.
How much did you yourself, as a writer, want to get a feeling or get inside the mind of someone who does have the standard issue career? Obviously, it's an interest for you because you wrote the book, but at the outset, how much did you want to get the feel for this sort of life?
Absolutely. I mean, curiosity is what tends to drive me and tends to drive most writers. And this book was a wonderful excuse to find out more about what people get up to. I mean, I think it's a standard thing that when we ask people what they do, the answer tends to be quite brief, but often it's utterly fascinating if you dig a little bit deeper and say to people, no, but, don't just tell me your job title. Tell me what you were doing at 11 o'clock this morning, or, take me exactly through an average working day. And frequently we don't know the answers even of our very good friends. We don't really know what they get up to. Of how many friends can we say, we know what their desk looks like or their workstation? We often just don't know these things about people close to us. So writing a book is a terrific excuse to be nosy and ask all the questions that normally you're not allowed to ask.
There is just a hugely fascinating element to, I don't know if I want to say the everyman questions, but asking people who aren't normally in a position in the media to be interviewed, what specifically are the details of their lives and their work. I talk to people, of course, on this show like you who have many things to say and who, of course, are prepared to talk about what they do. But what's the challenge? What are the challenges of approaching and getting this information out of somebody who it may surprise to even be asked?
Well, I think you're hinting at the answer, which is that the number one problem is that people think that their job might be boring, so they're very afraid not to bore you. But of course, it only becomes interesting. Very often, what people think is most boring about their lives actually turns out to be the most gripping. So I find myself a lot saying, no, let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Don't stop now. Let's keep going with this. Precisely at the moment when people thought they were actually boring me, and they weren't at all. I spent a couple of months with some accountants in a firm, and I had a terrific problem at the beginning getting them to take my project seriously, because they thought that I had to be joking and that I was bored. I must be bored by accountancy. And then one day I said to them, look, are you bored by accountancy? And they said, no, not at all. I said, well, take it from me that I'm not either. And, let's move forward. But as I say, there was a kind of suspicion that I might be bored.
That accountancy chapter, that was fascinating because it's a profession that employs so many people. I know in my graduating class in college, many went on to be accountants. But why did that a stereotype may not be the word, but the image of just deadening tedium get attached to accountancy above all other positions? It seems like boring. You say boring, somebody will say accountancy.
I mean, it is fascinating. Accountancy is clearly at the heart of capitalism. It is what literally accounts for what we are all doing. Take any organization, and its kind of DNA, its lifeblood, is being monitored by accountants. So that's why, to me, it felt very exciting and interesting to look at it. But I suppose the reason why people suspect that it might be very boring is that it's only interested in capturing numbers. We all of us know that the workplace is that odd tension between doing things for money, for numbers, and doing things for other reasons. And it seems like accountants are only interested in the numbers, whereas most of us like to think that we work and that we enjoy our work when we enjoy it for reasons that go way beyond just what the numbers are saying. But I found precisely this kind of tension between the two, between the numbers and the life that goes on around the numbers, very interesting. And most accountants are pretty lively, precisely because I think they have this fear that they might be a bit boring. So I saw some things in this office of accountants that would not have disgraced the most bohemian of writers, and was all very intriguing.
One of the things to be taken from that chapter is that accounting is not perhaps as boring as the public perception states, but there's also the part of the chapter where you have a bit of a conference with the head of the firm you're visiting, and I found it a little chilling, I'll admit, just the way you describe him as responding. How would you describe his persona?
Well, the head of this firm was... I think he'd been to too many conferences. He'd answered too many journalist questions. He'd put up a front. He was speaking in a way that you hear certain chief executives speak. He was speaking the language of modern business, which can be so drained of any emotion or kind of reality. It was just one cliche after another. And he really wasn't letting me in. Perhaps he wasn't letting himself in. It was hard to know whether the kind of deadness that he was conveying was something that he felt himself, or it was just a front. But I think, we've all come across that language sometimes. It's the language of the company brochure, where you just feel, that the truth is not being expressed. It's not that the truth is so awful. It's just there's this kind of fake, slightly kind of Orwellian language, which is, needs to be punctured and probed, I think. And that's what I was doing a little bit.
And Orwellian is a very choice word there, because correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not as if you're being lied to, but that nothing is being expressed whatsoever.
That's right, exactly. It's like, it's like eating proverbial air or kind of, something with no kind of content, no calories in it. Absolutely. It's the language of PR departments often who just don't want to say anything that might incriminate them. And they're very afraid of a kind of legalistic culture where they might say something and get into trouble. So they end up just speaking in bland platitudes. And that's the opposite of the way that one should be discussing business, because business, all of human life is there. And I think that's what got me irritated. Here was a guy who was sitting at the top of a vast organization, and he must have seen and witnessed and been in touch with so many interesting things, and yet he seemed completely out of touch with them.
And doesn't it seem especially odd that the head of a large firm, a large successful firm, who has to constantly defend his position and gain ground, this is the modern man of action, one of the modern sort of gladiator, you'd think that you'd think they'd be totally averse to using such muted, such drained language.
Yeah, but I think, you have to remember that the modern world of business is very cautious because there are so many dangers. You could say something wrong, you could put a foot wrong, etc. And I think, the really talented chief executives manage to say things which feel meaningful and real and capture what's actually going on, while at the same time, not causing themselves or their employees danger. But that's a difficult act and requires, I think, a kind of charm which not everybody has.
You'd think of, say, a Steve Jobs of Apple.
Yeah, I think sometimes you sense in what Jobs says a kind of realism. That he's not necessarily trying to hide everything. But even there's quite a lot of subterfuge. It's hard to find a genuinely plain-speaking sort of chief executive, but when you find them, people are tremendously grateful and appreciative.
Now, one of the other large companies you visited in writing this book, United Biscuit, what brought you there?
Well, I was interested. This is the UK's largest biscuit manufacturer, and what I wanted to look at really was a very large corporation that is very profitable on the back of doing something that is actually very, very small. So these guys have grown very rich making cookies, making something that occupies just a few moments in most of our days, and yet will throw off a large amount of money if done on a sufficient scale. And the question I was interested in looking at was the issue of meaning. I think one of the things we all want from our work is that it feels meaningful. Not just that it enables us to survive, though obviously that's important, but that it feels that at some level we're making a difference. We're touching somebody's lives. We're improving something. We are able to either reduce someone's suffering or produce some kind of delight. And I think in a very, very large corporation like United Biscuits, one of the discomforts of workers there was just the feeling of what difference are we making? I hang out with some of the people from the back office of United Biscuits, and it's a company with 15,000 employees. So if you're employee number 8,300, you're very, very far from making a biscuit. You might just be filling out reinsurance forms for the delivery of pallets to supermarkets or something. And you're so far from the meaning of biscuit making that your life feels just very alienated, very remote. And this I was curious about, and it seems like a quintessential modern problem.
When talking to the employees of United Biscuit, what did you find in terms of how they dealt with this feeling of when I was reading about lives devoted to a sub-process of a sub-process of a sub-process in biscuit making, even I felt a bit of despair. How did they deal with it?
Some of them found it genuinely troubling and couldn't see the bigger picture, even though they might be earning quite a good salary. Many of them fantasized about quitting it all, and there were many fantasies, incidentally, of quitting it in order to run a small business, a B&B or a local cafe or something like that. And I think that the reason for that is that what lies behind these much smaller scale service jobs is that we have a sense that we're making a difference because, you're bringing somebody their lunch and you see them eating it and they're happy. And that brings deep satisfaction. If you look at the way that children play, when they're playing, they very often like to play servant. They like to serve you. They like to bring you food, put something on a tray, hand it round, etc. There's something very satisfying about helping other people, about bringing something to other people. And yet, as I say, very large corporations cut us off from that sense and do leave people with that sense of kind of alienation.
Now, when these employees of United Biscuit said to you or implied that their fantasy was to go off and run a business where they're closer to the point of delivery, to the actual service or good they're giving to a customer, did this sound to you as if it was nothing more than that, a fantasy, or did people seem to have actual plans to escape, if I'm going to use a dramatic word there?
Well, I think a lot of them were realistic about the dangers of kind of entrepreneurship and knew, that kind of sort of family capitalism is very difficult to do. It places great stress on your loved ones. It means great risks, etc. And so they appreciated the fact that they were working working in a large corporation that was taking care of things like their health care or their pension plans. But they also knew the cost of that. And again, that's just something that is so archetypal to the modern world, that tension between the comfort of the large organization, the relative comfort of the large organization that follows on from school, it follows on from college, it shares something with school and colleges, that idea that you sort of, you're slightly signing your independence away, you get well looked after, but there is a loss of kind of autonomy, against which, against that kind of background, the fantasy of the small shop becomes very powerful and very appealing.
When you were talking, whether to United Biscuit employees or otherwise, employees of anywhere, and they of course, on some level, they would know all this, I suppose, that we're talking about, that there's the trade-off here. There's the large organization that provides for you, and then there's the venture that may be more satisfying on another level, but does not provide quite as well. Did they seem fully conscious of making this trade-off? Did they own that trade-off, or was it kind of a I don't really think about it much sort of situation?
Yeah, I think, like with all of us, it slightly depends on the day and how you're interpreting what you do. I mean, on a good day, I think, watching everybody at work, one of the things that we like about our work is that it keeps us distracted. There are some jobs that are right, actually dealing with the hottest, most meaningful issues of humanity. But for many of us, for most of us probably, work can be, at its best, a kind of agreeable and worthwhile distraction from some of these very large questions like, where's the world going? Most of us are not dealing with those questions. Most of us are just getting through an agenda, making our way to meetings, etc. But let's not forget that has its kind of satisfaction. I'm sure we all know that feeling when we're very busy, when we're almost too busy to ask the larger questions, but we can almost feel grateful to work for keeping us that busy. Because sometimes, staring at a blank wall and looking at the big questions of life doesn't really lead you anywhere. So there can be something very consoling about just being kept busy. And I know that has bad associations, the idea of just being distracted. That sounds like you're copping out of doing something more interesting or more worthwhile. But maybe that's too harsh. Maybe we all need, at some level, to have a busy agenda, to keep us focused on relatively achievable, small-scale goals, something to get us through the week.
Now, how closely is this tied with what you talk about at the very end of the pleasures and sorrows of work, that our jobs wouldn't be, and correct me if I have this at all wrong, that our jobs, or most of them, wouldn't necessarily be performable if we were thinking that our days were limited? Is there some connection here between, I suppose, what you just mentioned was the job as distraction, and then the necessity of being distracted from one's own limited time to perform the job, if that makes any sense?
Yes, I mean, I think that is the case. Anyone who's retired or watched other people retire know that retirement can be challenging. And this is something I was thinking about, that why is retirement challenging? It's not only because we place so much of our identity in work, but also because work keeps us, as I say, focused on certain challenges, certain goals. And once those goals disappear, and once you have nothing to do other than have a good time or just, think about life, it is possible, and it happens to a lot of people, slightly lose energy and motivation and optimism, because suddenly you're up against such huge questions. Suddenly there's no gap between you and death, and that is very frightening. And I think that's why people enjoy being kept busy. The other thing about work that is very satisfying when it goes well is that it means we're able to pour our energies into something which, on a good day, has a chance of being slightly better than we are. Something that is just that little bit more symmetrical, logical, kind, organized, whatever it may be, than we manage to be during our private lives, on the weekend or whatever. And there's something very satisfying about being able to take a step back from your work and look at it and say, I did that, whether that is a book or a pot or an organization or a symphony or a restaurant or whatever it is, but something that is just, as I say, a little bit better than you are, at your most kind of domestic moment.
And as a writer, your job, I imagine, or one imagines that you that you do a lot of your own setting of goals. It's your first job to figure out what your goal is. Is that as difficult as the writing itself?
Yes, I mean, I guess like anyone else in the workplace, you have to set yourself a goal, and you have to ask, what am I really, what are the things that matter most to me in my job? And one of the key things for writers is, am I writing to try and achieve some artistic goal, or am I trying to just gain maximal income? And that's often a choice that you face. For example, with this book, I had to ask myself, is this a book that many people are going to read? Some people are going to read. What are they going to think? How much should I, express the truth as I see it? There are passages in that book that are, in a sense, uncommercial because, well, they're a little bit bleak. They're saying some things about the workplace that maybe, I don't know, some people might not want to hear. But it felt important to me to be able to say them. So, it's always a trade-off, and I wrestled with this as much as anybody else in the workplace, I think.
We discussed a bit earlier, of course, how employees or anybody seeks to work in a position or do something that's closer to helping people. And now I think back to some other times you've said in interviews that you refer to yourself as a vulgar writer, meaning one of the world, one that deals with issues that are actually in the world. And I think about some of the books that I've read of yours. For example, How Proust Can Change Your Life, which I read yesterday, in fact, and The Consolations of Philosophy. These are books that seemingly are aimed toward helping people. How oriented toward helping people are you as a writer in general? How much of a priority is it?
Well, I'm very. I mean, I think it's very odd that the idea of writing that somehow makes things better is seen as having quite pejorative associations, particularly among high culture, among people who like to think of themselves as educated. But I mean, I very much believe that the point of reading is at some level to feel less lonely, to feel less isolated with feelings, and also to feel less confused. I think that books have a privileged place in letting us know we're not alone, and putting us, shedding light on situations which we find confusing or perplexing or dangerous. And I think this is what reading should be about. It's not just a distraction. It's not just to pass an exam. It's to kind of to help you get through the day. So that's how I feel as a reader and as a writer. I again very much feel that the point of books is to keep us, keep some of our anxieties at bay, to explain some of our problems, and as I say, to make us feel less lonely.
The phenomenon of books being books that try more outwardly to help being looked down on. I want to ask you why you think that might be. Is it an effect of, is it kind of a taint of the self-help book industry, largely regarded as kind of slimy, or what do you think that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the term self-help book is immediately associated with a certain kind of book. To be found in an airport often, it might have a pink cover, it might make an extravagant promise, like you'll never be unhappy again, or you'll have perfect sex forever, or something like this. And it's no wonder that with such titles and covers, these books get a bad reputation. Don't get me wrong, and that's not really the genre that I'm aiming at. But I think that there have been, throughout history, writers who've been interested in using literature, as I say, not just as a distraction, not just as an intellectual game, but as a way of kind of helping you to live. And that might mean being quite pessimistic sometimes. One of the features of self-help books is they're often incredibly optimistic and will tell you that everything will be okay. But I think more important than hearing that everything's going to be okay, I think, is very often hearing that you're not alone. And I would rather read a book that tells me, there are sides of life that are really dark, genuinely dark, but this is life. I'd rather read that expressed eloquently and kind of poignantly than to hear something which just doesn't feel true to my own experience.
And speaking of optimism, it seemed to be a quality, a state of mind present in force at the event you were in during your chapter on entrepreneurship, the Inventors Fair. Now, how, at a basic level, were these people different from those you would encounter in accountancy or in biscuit manufacture?
Yeah, I mean, what I was impressed about looking at entrepreneurs was, in a way, how reckless they were. And, we live in many ways in a very cautious society where adding up the pennies, and everyone's got to wear seatbelts, and there's a lot of regulations and a lot of red tape. But at the same time, human beings have another side to them, the kind of side that made people go to war and made people adventurers and made people take enormous risks and set out for distant continents. There's still that side of human nature, the more aggressive, adventurous, imaginative kind of side, if you like. And many of these traits are to be found in entrepreneurs who will often, take huge risks. And there's something almost romantic, if you like, about certain kinds of entrepreneurial activity for the sheer sort of recklessness with which people will burn up huge sums of money in the name of a dream, really. And I think it's interesting that in a very cautious society, we still allow ourselves to do that. And, you see it regularly in things like the dot-com boom and other times. You see people acting irrationally. Of course, that creates a lot of debris and damage. But it's also a sign of life and of health. And so I think, I was left ambivalent. I was left at one level celebrating the entrepreneurs, much as I could see their downsides too.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Find our complete interview archive, hear this show again or any others at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Alain de Botton, author of fiction, non-fiction, journalism, and various hybrids thereof. His new book is The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work. There's this certain brand of entrepreneurial optimism specific to the entrepreneur, and when I talk to friends who are entrepreneurial, it seems not to be simple sort of kind of a candide brand of optimism where they just assume that whatever they do, it'll probably turn out okay. I mean, that's kind of the impression that one gets from reading the couple in your book that's marketing the crisp bar, the chips, as we would call them here, put together into a bar form, an idea I never would have considered. But it's an optimism that, to my mind, doesn't assume this venture will work out, but seems to assume that in the long run something will, or the next one will be better, or the one that accepts and maybe even embraces failure. Did you find that when you talk to entrepreneurs or not?
Yes, absolutely. They see themselves as people who are kind of discovering new needs. It's that creative, all of us have that little side of us that is entrepreneurial. When we go through the world and we say, hey, that could be a good business. We notice something a little bit wrong with the world, and we say that could be a good business. Someone needs to turn that idea into a business, whatever it is. A drawer that doesn't open properly, and we think of a new way to fix it, or we notice some service that is missing from the world. All of us have that side, but entrepreneurs take that one bit further, and the ones that succeed are an interesting breed, because ultimately the ones that succeed are those who are ambitious enough to be able to dream, but realistic enough to be able to avoid crashing into reality. They're able to have that fine balance between the dreamer and the realist. And most of us are either a little bit too realistic for our own good, we're a little bit too pessimistic, too cautious, or we're just kind of reckless. And it is almost awe-inspiring to see people who hit that balance absolutely perfectly, manage to get that pitch, and manage to get it right.
And often, I find, tell me if you found it, that the entrepreneurs that are hitting that pitch, that have the most confidence, do in fact tend to be the ones that have failed, perhaps multiple times.
Yes, that's right, and they have a confidence, and you wonder where it comes from. It almost makes me think of a child who's been, so well looked after by their parents that they're not afraid of the world. They're sure of themselves. They make a real difference between who they are and what happens to them. And they know that just because something bad happens to them doesn't mean they're bad people. They're able to look at the world in a kind of unparanoid way. And as I say, that's as much a psychological achievement as it is a business achievement. And as I say, it's fascinating to watch.
How does I'll call it provisionally, the romanticism of the entrepreneur differ from what you might find to be the romanticism of the painter, Stephen Taylor, for example, who you follow in the book? These are two people following what might be considered a capital T, capital D, the dream. What separates the way they approach it, their ambition?
Well, strangely, not that much. I think there are real similarities between many jobs, even those that on the surface look very different. So I think you could compare a kind of business, an entrepreneur, to a painter, and make interesting analogies. I mean, one basic analogy is that a successful painter and a successful entrepreneur, at some level, are understanding what their clients need. And I know that sounds vulgar when speaking about a painter, because one expects that painters are not thinking about clients, and maybe they're not consciously, but unconsciously, what a good painter is doing is saying, what do people want out of their art? And it might be something like, they want a reminder of nature, they want a reminder of peace and quiet, they want a reminder of beauty. And the good artist delivers on that. It's like the good entrepreneur delivers on the needs of his or her kind of clients. So definitely, one shouldn't put art in some totally different category. It's not in an ivory tower. It's one kind of business like any other. And those who make it in art are quite similar to those who make it in other fields of industry.
And I want to get an idea of how successful a painter is Stephen Taylor, because you describe him, he's sort of I don't know if he's in an early stage of commerce in his career, but what was his degree of I don't know if even success is the word, but how well, I suppose, was what he was providing engaging with what the art demand was?
Well, I think that when we hear about art in the kind of public sphere, on television or in the press, we often hear about very successful artists, and I think it's important to remember that most artists are not very successful. The greatest majority are not successful, so it felt important when writing the book to pick an artist who was talented, certainly, but perhaps was not Picasso, was not Matisse, was not a famous kind of artist, because that's almost a cliche. The famous artist with all their tensions and mistresses and fortunes and all the rest of it. And so this artist he's not particularly successful, but he's driven by, I guess, what one would call a calling, which is a strange word, because I don't think many of us have callings, professionally. I think many of us have little kinds of fragments of interest that we try and assemble into a professional destiny. But sometimes you do get people who will ignore certain financial strains and will just go for it and devote themselves entirely to something. And it's very moving to watch when it happens.
And as far as callings, there did seem to be a calling in effect when you went to watch the engineers and technicians launching the satellite for the Japanese television company. Would that be correct to say that these are people who were called to do this sort of thing, to do these technical tasks?
Well, I was interested in looking at these people who, not humorously, one can actually call rocket scientists. These are people who are working out how to send rockets to space and launch satellites. And I was amazed by their dedication to what is basically a communal activity, a group activity. If you read about the history of science, you think it's all lone heroes. It's Newton under his apple tree, and it's Thomas Edison in his factory, etc. But it's kind of the idea of the genius, the amazing genius. But modern science and engineering tends to be a group activity. It's made up of a lot of people collaborating on quite small problems, often working on some tiny aspect of, satellite ballistics or whatever it happens to be. And again, that's very interesting to see, particularly for me as a writer, which is a very individualistic activity. It's very interesting to see people who put their egos aside and individual egos and just surrender themselves to a group that might be spending 15 years working out some tiny problem that will, make a satellite work better, and will probably gain no public recognition, and yet will have done something that does, in a small way, make a big difference.
How much more difficult is it as a writer to get I don't know if insight is the word, but to approach a group of people who work in such a rarefied, specialized technical environment, and one that's so collective as well? I imagine it would be quite a bit harder than, say, a lone painter to talk to and to get any information that you can give to a general reader out of.
Yes, I think one of the real problems of the modern world is that the way in which lots of things work is simply too hard for the layperson to understand. It's no surprise that most of what's going on when you read the newspaper is, private lives of actors and actresses, or domestic murders or whatever, because these things are actually easier to explain than the big things about how the world works. I'm thinking about technology or science or industry. And so the underreporting of the working world has sometimes a lot to do with the sheer complexity of the working world. How can you explain how, what on earth a satellite does in 1,000 words or something? But, I saw that as a kind of challenge. And even though from reading my book you're not going to be able to be a rocket scientist, you'll hopefully get a flavor of at least the kind of territory that these people are kind of working in, and what that means to the rest of us.
Is it, to your mind, the same basic task to take what is in, for example, Proust, or what Seneca writes, or the workings of a satellite, and make those into a form that are digestible to a general audience? Is this all one and the same task, or are these very distinct in terms of the process you have to go through to make them palatable to any given reader?
Well, so simply in terms of working methods, with this book, I didn't go to the library very much. What I really did was to go out into the field. So it's a piece of field work, a piece of journalism or kind of ethnography, if you like. So it's kind of, I sometimes like to describe it as a kind of piece of philosophical journalism. And that is very different from book, analysis. But in terms of what you have to do to communicate to an audience, I think communication is the same. I'm sure you know from your work on the radio, it's whatever it is, whatever the material is, you're trying to do something similar always with it, which is to make it digestible to an audience who may not know very much about the subject, who may not feel that they're interested in it. And you've got to present it. It's like being a chef, and you've got to turn some raw ingredients into something that diners are going to enjoy.
And you've been billed by your publisher this time around as having created your own genre of this sort of thing. To what extent do you agree that you have done that?
Well, I've been very inspired by other writers, people like Norman Mailer and his journalism, also Virginia Woolf and her essays, the wonderful American nonfiction writer John McPhee, who writes a lot about industry and transport. These people have all been inspirations, but I suppose what's slightly unusual about this book is that it's got a kind of philosophical tinge, if you like. It's asking big questions. It's a mixture of the kind of journalistic and the more philosophical, and that is a slightly unusual kind of hybrid genre. But there's nothing quite new under the sun. But it's just maybe a slightly different emphasis.
There's one issue I've seen come up in when you've talked about this book before, in interviews and whatnot, that the chapter on career counseling, when you follow around that career counselor who works out of his home there, and you paint him as a bit of a, I don't know if marginalized is the word, but certainly not at the forefront of, not in the forefront of the public eye. Why is it that, and this is something that I've heard you ask before, so I realize I'm repeating something that you've thought about. Why is it that career counseling is not, in this age where work is so prioritized, why do you think it isn't more important?
Well, I think that, at one level, it is seen as very important. Anybody who has a problem in the workplace, people will often suggest, hey, why don't you go and see a career counselor? Why don't you see a work therapist, somebody who can kind of help you? But the honest truth is that this job, which occupies this very important space, is in certain key ways lacking the tools that would be required to make that job effective. I don't think humanity yet knows how to put every single human being into a job which suits them, which they'll be good at, and which will be productive for all parties. We just don't know. I think career counseling as a profession is a little bit where medicine was in the Middle Ages. We know what we want it to do, but we don't yet kind of know exactly how to get there. And I think that's why sometimes career counselors are slightly marginalized or not taken that seriously. They're asking the right questions, but do they really have the answers? They're a little bit like creative writing teachers, who similarly will say that everybody can have a glorious destiny as a writer. But actually, that's maybe not true. Just as career counselors tell us that everybody can be, you can find the way to unlock anybody's secret potential. But I wonder sometimes whether that is true. We don't yet have all the tools.
The methods you do describe, the career counselor you follow using in the book, they do seem rather oblique and somewhat vague. What are some of the factors, do you think, that are standing in the way of the ideal, of the ideal meritocracy, the ideal every person goes to the job that they most want, the fantasies of the high school communist in a way? But what's getting in the way of the job individual match, a better match for
Well, I think one of the key things is that we find it very, very hard to know what we want to do. And this is a very strange thing. I mean, we don't feel this in relation to food, for example. We don't ever sit around going, what shall I eat? We kind of know immediately what we want to eat. But we don't know with careers. We can be in a situation where we think, I know I'm unhappy, but I don't know what would make me happy. And I think some of the reason for that is that as we grow up, our desires in relation to our careers become very, very entangled in concerns for status and for money. And these things kind of interrupt our more kind of native and authentic pursuits of satisfying work. So we get very inhibited. If you look at children playing, children will know immediately what it is they want to play at. They don't sit around going, should I play with a Lego or should I draw? They'll just go for it and they'll do it, and they won't be conflicted about it. Whereas, the older you get and the more you have to take on responsibilities, the more you kind of bury your more authentic sides. And this is one of the things that the career counselor was keen on. He wanted to ask people how, what it was that they imagined themselves doing when they were children. Because in his view, if you remember what it is you wanted to be as a child, you get some very important clues as to where your real interests lie, that maybe they get stamped out as you grow up and you have to take up adult responsibilities.
And you mentioned this issue of status and the concern and the desire for status becoming overwhelming to whatever desires you may have had of what you wanted to do. And of course, you wrote a whole book, Status Anxiety. Is there any even emerging idea about how one might address that?
Well, I think it's very important to remember, basically, when we judge ourselves and when we judge other people, and we do judge a lot, that what happens to us and others is not strictly linked, not always linked to how good or bad we or other people are. There's in the Middle Ages, when people looked at people at the bottom of society, those people at the bottom used to be called unfortunates. In other words, people on whom fortune had not smiled. Nowadays, we call people at the bottom of society losers. And that tells us something very important between the difference between our age and the pre-modern age. Nowadays, we kind of imagine that everybody is writing their own biography. You are entirely responsible for what happens to you. And this makes the workplace full of anxiety, because it means that we're always worried that someone's going to come along and, look at our careers and going to judge us very unfavorably. And I think that's very tough. We live in a very work-oriented culture, and I think what we need to do, particularly in an economic crisis, is to remember that people's professional lives is only one part of a wider, richer, more complicated human being. And we always need to kind of keep on the lookout for that other human being.
This theme of figuring out what we want, of knowing what we want, of going through the surprisingly difficult process of understanding our own desires, it seems to me this is a theme I have heard come up in your other books as well. Maybe not all of them, but several of them. Now, is this a theme that has interested you for a long time?
Yes, I think it is fascinating how we don't really understand ourselves, how it can take so long to understand what it was that we were trying to say, what it was that we were trying to do. I think this is kind of part of the difficulty of being a human being. Just it takes us so long, and also, on the whole, life doesn't wait for us. So, when you graduate from college, you have to pretty quickly decide what it is you want to do. Just as in marriage, for example, very often you have to decide quite quickly whether you want to get together with somebody. And there's a lot of pressure to take decisions. And very often, as I say, it can take decades to work out what sort of people we really are and what makes us happy. In the workplace, it can mean tremendous changes across a lifetime that people will discover, and it's almost like coming out actually in a new way. You gather your family and you say, well, I've got something important to tell you. You always thought I was an accountant, but actually, I'm secretly a landscape gardener. And, people might get upset and, your sister might start crying and run upstairs going, you've let us all down. But I think we all need to go through these sort of journeys of discovery.
And you yourself, you I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read that you landed on writer only. Were there other things you'd considered before and rejected?
Well, I was kind of broadly interested in ideas and creativity, and if you're interested in those sort of things nowadays, you'll probably look at things like documentary, which I looked at, and I looked a lot at academia and trying to climb up the academic ladder. I was interested in journalism, so just a variety of things, but always with the idea of public policy ideas, theories, thinking, writing. These are the things that get me going.
And as I mentioned in the beginning in the very intro of the interview, that you are a founding member of the School of Life. And now, how is this distinct from the School of the Ivory Tower, the School of Academia, the School of School?
Well, it's a deliberate provocation. It's a new institution which some friends of mine and I set up about a year ago now. And the idea was really to say, very often academia lets us down because it doesn't help us to ask the big questions, like how are we going to live, who are we going to get married to, how are we going to approach our work, what are we going to do about death and growing old and aging parents and children, and all of these things which are so at the center of our lives. They very often only get dealt with by sort of popular magazines or something. But you go to a university and they're not being dealt with. So we wanted to use culture, top quality knowledge, insights drawn from history, psychology, philosophy, literature, and use those insights to try and answer some of these very large and basic questions that often get ignored. So that was the goal of the school, and we've been going now for about 6 months, and we're getting a meeting with a lot of public interest and curiosity, and I think people like the style because it's different from what you would get in a normal adult education or university setting.
And why do you think that institutions of seriousness have thus far ignored these questions of what I would imagine are very high seriousness indeed as they apply to us all?
I think there are many reasons. I think one of the reasons is that it can be very hard to measure success when you're trying to answer questions of life, of everyday life. If you're trying to work out, what a wise answer is to your career problem or something, it's very hard to sort of set an exam for that. And so academics who are looking out for ways to judge and measure results of a huge kind of student body tend to shirk away from these kind of softer, but in a way bigger and more urgent questions in favor of something that you can put through a machine and grade someone on. And then I think there's also just a suspicion that maybe this is trivial, maybe this isn't serious enough, because there's a certain kind of naivety often to wisdom and to answers for how to live. This can look unimpressive, and if you're worried about your status as an academic, you might want to try and make yourself sound authoritative, maybe hard to understand. Kind of needless complexity can creep in from a kind of professional anxiety.
And this is perhaps a question to which no super concrete answer exists, but how much of a contributor would you imagine that the not failure to ask, but maybe maybe ignoring the big questions contributes to these career crises we've discussed, or any crises?
Yes, I mean, I think that we store up problems if we don't give ourselves time to explore and to sort of meditate, to think and reflect on what's happening to us. We store up crises, we store up anxiety, certainly, and they tend to blow up on our face. And I know many people who work very, very hard, and they know that things might not be exactly right, but they can't quite stop ever to look at it. And then they burn out, or they come to a crisis, and they just have to quit the job and take a few months off and just regroup and rethink. It's just part of the modern world. It's incredibly hard to find the motivation and the support that we need in order to find a quiet place to think. And one of my hopes for my books is, in a way, they are quiet places to think. They are places that will encourage a certain kind of reflection. So, taking little notes in the margin, that's what I'd love my readers to do as they reflect on their own lives through the prism of the lives and ideas that I'm introducing them to.
The title of the most recent book, or the most recent quiet place to think, is The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work. Alain de Botton, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
If you'd like more information on Alain de Botton and his works, visit alaindebotton.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our music, as always, is produced by Ben Althouse. His site is available at benalthouse.com. If you'd like to rehear this program or any other Marketplace of Ideas interview, visit colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.